Welcome back, Escalia family. In this video, we're going to discuss the difference between a good carb versus a bad carb within the context of metabolic diseases like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, PCOS, etc., so that you know exactly which carbs to eat more of and which ones to avoid. Now, I want to start off this lesson by saying that in reality, there's actually no such thing as a good carb or a bad carb, right? It's relative. And I want you to start to shift your perspective as you go through this lesson. Instead, I want you to start thinking about what carbs can your body tolerate and to what degree. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's start off with a simple example to illustrate this point. Let's take high fructose corn syrup, which is commonly understood as being generally unhealthy to consume, right? We always hear on the internet or on YouTube not to consume high fructose corn syrup and corn syrup in general, or fructose, because it's generally unhealthy for us. Now, let's say that you are a diabetic with a fatty liver, for example. Eating excess high fructose corn syrup from processed foods like sodas, junk foods, candies, etc., can actually be very dangerous and damaging to your health and your particular situation. And this is because your metabolism is currently dysfunctional due to the fact that you're a diabetic and you have a fatty liver. And because of that, your system cannot actually handle fructose or even high amounts of glucose in this dysfunctional state. Now compare that to an athlete who is lean, has a low body fat percentage, and doesn't have any metabolic conditions like diabetes or a fatty liver. Their metabolism and their body can actually handle high fructose corn syrup relatively well. And this is because their metabolic system, their body is functioning optimally and is actually robust, which allows them to use fructose as a fuel source efficiently. In fact, the research shows that high fructose corn syrup can actually boost athletic performance during exercise if you have a healthy and normal functioning metabolism. Now, why am I telling you this? It's because I want you to break free from the black and white perspective of good versus bad, and instead look at the effects of carbs in terms of how well your system can tolerate them and to what degree. And when you shift your perspective in this way, you will no longer be confused about what carbs you should and shouldn't eat. And it'll also give you the flexibility to enjoy your favorite junk carbs responsibly without sabotaging your results, so you can still enjoy your favorite foods without having to feel bad about it or without actually worsening your condition in the process. Now, that being said, I do want to stress that if you do have NAFLD or if you do have metabolic syndrome, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or any other metabolic condition, then you want to 100% avoid sources of high fructose corn syrup, or at least drastically reduce your consumption. So make sure that you read the ingredients list on any and all packaged food, drinks, dressings, sauces, soups, condiments, anything that you purchase really. So if you're reading a label or the nutrition facts or the ingredients list on a particular product and you see the words high fructose corn syrup or corn syrup or fructose syrup, stay away from it. It is basically poison at this point. And this is because almost all ingested fructose that we consume gets directly absorbed by the liver, because fructose is not actually allowed to circulate to the rest of the body like glucose can, because most of your cells, the vast majority of your cells, can't utilize fructose as a food source or a fuel source. They utilize glucose. And so your liver quickly absorbs all of it as you ingest it. And when you already have metabolic issues like a fatty liver and you consume a ton of fructose, your liver absorbs all of that. And guess what happens? All that fructose gets converted into fat and is then stored within the liver itself, which of course will contribute to almost all the drivers of metabolic disease progression and weight gain and make you sicker. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about the easiest way to know which carbs are good for us versus which carbs will make us sicker. When deciding on what carbohydrates to eat, there are two questions we need to ask ourselves. The first question is, will this carbohydrate prevent sudden spikes in my blood sugar and insulin levels? This is important because if our blood sugar and insulin levels are constantly spiking because of the kind of carbs that we eat, then we will eventually develop issues like insulin resistance, which is a huge driver of metabolic disease. And if you want to learn more about insulin resistance, I recommend that you watch the What Causes NAFLD videos for a more complete explanation on that topic. The second question that we need to ask ourselves is, will this carbohydrate slow down the absorption of glucose and fructose coming in from the carbs that we eat from my intestines and into my bloodstream? Right? This is important because if we eat the right carbs, that slow down the absorption rate of glucose and fructose into our blood, then we will prevent sudden spikes in our blood sugar levels and thus prevent issues like insulin resistance from occurring. So now at this point, you should be asking, okay, what kind of carbs meet these two criteria? What kind of carbs answer these two questions, Dr. Herrera? How do I pick the right kind of carbs, right? Well, it is very, very simple. And for some reason, and I have no idea why, but this isn't talked about enough, what I'm about to share you, because the answer is literally staring at us in the face. And for some reason, many doctors, nutritionists, dietitians, and other professionals just don't explain this part for whatever reason. But the key to figuring out which carbs to eat and which carbs are actually good for you is fiber. Specifically, how much fiber is in that particular carb. Simply put, the more fiber that is in that carbohydrate, the healthier it will be for you. The lower the fiber content in that carb, the more unhealthier it will be for you. Now, why is fiber so important? It's because the fiber found in healthy carbohydrates that you eat are what actually slows down and even prevents the rapid and excess absorption of glucose and fructose and even fats from your digestive tract from the foods that we eat. This is because when you eat certain kind of plant fibers, they actually turn into a sticky gel in your intestines as you digest your food. And this gel actually traps a lot of the excess glucose, the fructose, and even the fats that you consume from your meal and prevents them from being directly absorbed into your bloodstream. Isn't that cool? And for some reason, no one explains that part, but it's super important to understand. And the research has reflected this fact for decades. We've known this for decades, that consuming adequate amounts of the right kind of fiber leads to improvements in healthy blood sugar levels, insulin sensitivity, lowering unhealthy cholesterol levels, healthy and regular bowel movements, which is super important for detoxification. It also feeds healthy gut bacteria so they can grow and create a more balance in your gut, which is important because a gut imbalance has been linked to things like fatty liver disease. Obviously, it aids in weight loss, satiety, feeling fuller for a longer period of time after a meal, and so much more. It's a super, super important part of nutrition. Now, some people think that they can use supplements to increase their fiber intake, and you can. And later on in other videos, I'll discuss in more detail how to use some key products to help supplement your fiber intake so you can reach those daily goals in other videos. But by and large, the best sources of fiber are going to come from your whole grain, unprocessed carbohydrates. Now, I have compiled the list that you can see here on screen of the best foods, of the best kinds of carbohydrates that meet our criteria of a healthy, high fiber source. And at this point, I would recommend replacing all of your carbohydrate intake with the food that you see on this list. You can also find a complete list of these foods, as well as other important guidelines in the document guide that is actually provided in the download section of this lesson for your convenience. Now, one thing that I want to bring to your attention is the topic of fruit. As you can see, whole fruit is on this list at the very end here. Whole fruit is okay. Now, a lot of people on social media, on YouTube and the internet, in general tend to say to not eat fruit if you have a fatty liver or other metabolic issues, right? And they say this because the sugar in fruit is in the form of fructose. And as we discussed earlier, that consuming too much fructose is detrimental to your health, especially if you're already metabolically compromised. But these people are missing one crucial piece of the fruit puzzle, and that is fiber. If you consume whole fruit, right, for example, apples or berries with the skin intact, then the fiber found within those fruits will actually prevent the excess absorption of that fructose. This means that not only is it okay to eat whole fruit, but I would actually encourage it. In fact, studies also support the consumption of whole fruit as part of a balanced diet in the prevention and management of many metabolic diseases, including fatty liver. For example, the Mediterranean diet, which is probably the most well-studied diet to date. One of the main characteristics of that particular dietary approach is whole fruits and whole vegetables, right? So whole fruits are okay. Now, the only caveat, right, the only exemption here is that this only applies to whole fruit. If you blend or if you juice the fruit and remove the fiber in the process, then that's a different story, and you should avoid consuming blended drinks or fruit juices without the pulp, because then you got rid of the fiber and it's no longer the same thing. Now, let's talk about what are the worst low fiber carbohydrate sources to look out for so that you do not eat these particular kinds of unhealthy carbs. So in order to keep this as simple as possible, because we can get really complicated really fast when it comes to this kind of stuff, I want to just give you a list of ingredients and nutrition facts to watch out for the next time you purchase food. So make sure that you read the ingredients list and the nutrition facts and you compare it to this list so that you know what to avoid and what kind of carbs to not purchase and to not eat. Now, as you read these labels, if you see any of the following words, then do not buy that product, do not eat that particular carbohydrate. These can be found in packages of bread, pasta, many healthy, quote unquote, healthy nutrition bars, dressings, soups, and so on. So for example, we have refined, enriched, right? We often read enriched white flour, enriched bleached flour, degerminated. All of these terms means that they've basically stripped the fiber out of the original carbohydrate and just basically give you this super refined, pre-digested form of these breads and cereals. Also, if you look at the nutrition facts label, as you can see here on screen on the right side, and you go to the carbohydrate section and you see that there has been added sugars that are put into the product, you also want to avoid that carb, because what that means is that they literally just added extra sugar to the food in order to improve the taste or the texture or whatever. So that's not good. We want to avoid those. Also, as a general rule, if there are less than 5 grams of fiber per serving, then you want to avoid that food, right? So as you can see here in the nutrition facts, if you go to the dietary fibers section, as you can see, there's 0 grams of fiber in this particular product. If there is less than 5 grams of fiber, you want to avoid it because all that's going to do is spike your blood sugar and therefore spike your insulin and make you sicker and fatter and worse. Now, one last thing about carbs that I want you to look out for, and this is super important because many people are deeply confused about this last piece, and it's not entirely their fault, and I will show you why. It concerns the topic of whole grains. Now, we have all heard at one point or another to eat more whole grain foods, cereals, breads, etc., right? But no one seems to explain what it actually means for a food to be truly whole grain. And more importantly, how to tell if that bread or that cereal or that product that you buy at the grocery store is actually whole grain. As you can see here on screen, I put a diagram that shows you the anatomy of a wheat plant and a wheat kernel in particular. As you can see on the diagram, especially on the right side, we can see the wheat kernel itself. The actual wheat kernel is the part that we use to actually make bread, for example. And it's made up of several parts. You can see that it contains bran layers and an outer husk. You also have the endosperm, and then finally you have the germ itself, right? The germ of the grain. Now, the term whole grain literally means that the entire grain was used in order to make that particular flour or that particular bread or whatever food product that you buy at the grocery store. Meaning that whole grain wheat bread, for example, will contain the bran, the husk, the endosperm, and the germ of the entire wheat kernel. If it is missing any of these parts, then it is not a whole grain, not truly a whole grain. Now, this is super important to understand because if that wheat bread that you see at the grocery store does not include the bran, for example, then it will have very low fiber because most of the fiber found in wheat is in the bran layers, right? If the wheat germ has been removed, then that wheat bread or flour or whatever it is will not have all the vitamins and minerals that are found in wheat that we so commonly hear about, and so on. The problem with most wheat bread and cereal products is that they remove several of these nutritious components and only leave you with basically the endosperm, which is basically just glucose or the simple sugar part of the kernel. So they're basically giving you a pre-digested carb that will flood your system with glucose, which is not good, especially if you have a fatty liver, diabetes, or any other metabolic condition. And the worst part about it is that food companies can legally trick you into thinking that you're buying a whole grain product when in fact it is not. Here we have a table that actually shows you some of the ways that these companies can legally mislead you. For example, if the label on that particular product says that it is made with whole grains, right? If you see that on the label itself, then what that means is that it may contain a little or a lot of whole grains. So we actually don't know the exact percentage of how much of that particular bread or food or pasta is actually made with whole grains. And chances are that most of it's going to be cheap flour that is highly refined. If you see the phrase whole grain, right, just those two words, all that means is that as little as 51% of the whole grain flour actually comes from whole grains, which is crazy, right? And then you have good source of whole grain. We see that all the time with different cereals and different breads. That means that about 15 to 25% of the product is actually coming from whole grains. The rest is just refined flour. And then lastly, we have multigrain, which we see all the time as well, very common. All that means is that there's a mixture of grains, which is possibly all or mostly refined grains. No wonder people are confused about carbs. Many folks are eating many of these products thinking that they're actually making good and healthy choices, when in fact they are just worsening their health. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. But we are not going to make the same mistake because I'm going to show you how to properly identify true whole grain products. Here's another table that I sourced from wholegrainscouncil.org, which is a great resource that I recommend you read up on and learn more about this particular topic. Now, if you see any of these words on the product labels, then you can actually rest assured that you are indeed buying a true whole grain product. For example, if you see the word or the phrase whole grain and then the name of the grain, so for example, whole grain wheat, then that means it does contain all the parts of the actual wheat kernel, which is what we want. Again, the word whole wheat is another good indicator. Whole, oat, stone ground whole wheat or stone ground whole oat, brown rice. If it says oats or oatmeal or wheat berries, etc., these are all good indicators that this is a true whole grain product. So please make sure to double check your labels and make sure that you are buying the right and correct carbohydrates to support your health. Now, the last thing that I want to share with you is how to actually figure out how much high fiber carbs you need to eat per day in order to reap these benefits. Now, this topic can be fairly complex and there are some variations depending on the individual circumstance of the person and their needs. But to keep this as simple as possible for you, here are some simple general guidelines to get you started. And of course, if you want some more personalized strategy or advice that fits your specific needs, I highly recommend that you book a call with me or join my one-on-one elite transformation coaching program. But nevertheless, here are some quick guidelines to get you started on the right track. Now, the first tip is to aim to eat at least 30 grams of total fiber per day, right? 40 grams is better, but at the very least, try to aim for 30 grams of fiber. Another way to approach this is to make sure that you're eating at least 15 grams of fiber for every 1,000 calories of food that you eat in a day, right? So if you're eating 2,000 calories a day, then that's 30 grams of fiber, right? It's just another way to kind of look at it and to plan it out. Now, if you're eating less than 2,000 calories a day, I would still recommend for you to aim for at least 30 grams of fiber, right? Practically speaking, this can look like 6 to 10 servings of green vegetables and fruits per day. So if you want to kind of just aim for a practical goal, make that your goal. Just 6 to 10 servings of vegetables and fruits per day. You can also do 2 to 3 servings of legumes, like nuts, for example, oats or barley per day, because those are really high fiber sources and you don't need to eat a whole lot of them to reach these goals. It's actually very simple if you stick to the carbohydrate list that I gave you, because all of those carbs are going to have high amounts of fiber in them. And then finally, if you want to look at it on a meal to meal basis, let's say you don't want to track 30 grams throughout the day, then I recommend aiming for at least 5 to 6 grams of fiber per serving of carbohydrates in a given meal. And you can always follow the nutrition facts on any packaged food label in order to determine how much dietary fiber is actually found in each serving of that food. For example, as you can see here on screen, I took a little screenshot of what that looks like on the actual label. So that is it for this lesson on carbs. I hope this has given you some more clarity on figuring out what carbohydrates are best for your specific health situation. Let me know what your biggest aha moment was in this lesson. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comment section below. See you in the next one.